I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap, and I needed somewhere close to the city for a weekend of work. The listing made it look perfect. A small 2-bedroom house in a quiet suburban area, plenty of space, clean, and with a backyard. I had been traveling a lot for work lately, and I was exhausted, so the idea of a quiet weekend in a house that wasn't a hotel seemed perfect. I arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting, and the streets were oddly empty. Not empty in a city way, but empty in a suburban way, like the neighborhood had been frozen in time. The houses were all neatly kept, but the grass in some yards was slightly overgrown, and a few cars were parked in odd places, almost like the owners didn't expect anyone to move them for a while. I had never been to this part of town before. The GPS guided me to a narrow street that twisted around in ways I hadn't expected. When I pulled up to the house, I realized it was smaller than the pictures suggested. The exterior was plain, a beige box with a brown roof, and the windows were dark. I parked and unlocked the front door with the key code the host had sent me. Inside, the house smelled faintly of bleach, but not in a clean way. More like someone had scrubbed everything recently to hide something. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No cars, no dogs barking, no distant sounds of people talking or music playing. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's waiting for something to happen. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe everyone was just inside because it was getting dark. I explored the house. The furniture was minimal but tidy. Everything worked. Lights, plumbing, appliances, but there was a sense of emptiness, like no one had lived here in months. I unpacked a few things, made myself a cup of coffee, and settled on the couch. That's when I noticed it, the faint creaking. At first, I thought it was the floorboards, but the sound was too deliberate, like something heavy had moved across the hall. I froze and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling. As the night went on, I tried to relax. I took a shower, brushed my teeth, and went to bed early. The bedroom was at the back of the house, and I could see the backyard through a sliding glass door. There was a thin layer of fog forming just above the grass, and the streetlights barely reached the yard. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving across the backyard. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but then it moved again, slower this time, closer to the house. I held my breath, straining my eyes. Whatever it was, it stopped when I moved closer to the window. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound, the creak of the floors, the hum of the refrigerator, even the wind brushing against the windows, kept me awake. In the morning, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe a stray cat or a raccoon had wandered through. I didn't want to overthink it. I spent the day working remotely. The house had Wi-Fi, which was stable enough for calls and emails, but the quiet was oppressive. I would glance out the windows and see nothing, the fog still lingering in the yard. When I decided to step outside for some fresh air, I noticed something odd. The backyard gate was slightly open, even though I was certain I had locked it. There were no footprints in the grass, but the dirt near the fence looked disturbed. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe the wind had pushed the gate. But by evening, I started noticing small things inside the house. A kitchen drawer that had been closed was slightly open. The towels in the bathroom were not where I had left them. The bed sheets were a little wrinkled, as if someone had lain on them. Every time I checked, there was nothing out of place, except that sense of movement, subtle, like the house had been lived in while I was out. I didn't want to call the host. The reviews had been positive, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. I decided to leave the next morning instead of pushing through another night. But that night, the sounds returned, louder this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above me. I didn't even know there was a second floor. It wasn't mentioned in the listing. I stayed in the living room, flashlight in hand, too scared to move. The steps stopped directly above me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I waited for what felt like hours. Then, faintly, I heard a soft click, the front door. I grabbed my keys and phone and stayed frozen on the couch. I didn't hear anyone enter, didn't hear any voices, just the faint, deliberate silence of someone moving around inside. I realized I was trapped. My car keys were in the kitchen, which meant leaving the living room meant walking through the area that had already been disturbed. I stayed where I was until I heard the car pull away. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor had entered by mistake, but the street was empty and no cars were near. That's when I noticed it. The front door was locked from the inside. I had locked it when I arrived. I checked all the windows. All were closed and latched. My stomach sank. Someone had been inside the house while I was there. They had access to the doors and windows, and I hadn't even noticed. I barely slept that night. I sat with the lights on, checking the locks repeatedly. In the morning, I packed everything in a hurry, left the key in the lockbox, and got out. I didn't even think about contacting the host yet. I just wanted to be anywhere else. On my way out of the neighborhood, I noticed something in the side mirror. A car parked 2 houses down, windows tinted, engine off, but as I drove by, I could swear I saw movement inside. I kept driving until I hit a main road. Once I was home, I reported the Airbnb to the platform, explaining everything in detail. They responded quickly, apologizing and refunding the stay. The host claimed they had no idea what I was talking about, but I didn't believe them. I never stayed in a house like that again, and I never booked a place without checking reviews for safety features. Looking back, the worst part wasn't the fear at the time. It was the realization that someone could have been in the house with me, unnoticed, for hours. The way they had moved things around, checked doors, and possibly watched me sleep, it was methodical. It made me feel vulnerable in a way I had never felt before. I started researching incidents in Airbnb rentals and realized that break-ins disguised as stays were not as uncommon as I had thought. The next time I traveled, I booked a small hotel instead of an Airbnb. I didn't care about the cost. Safety mattered more than comfort. I kept thinking about that empty house, the quiet streets, and the shadows in the backyard. It wasn't a story of ghosts or monsters. It was something more real, something people don't want to think about. How quickly a stranger can enter your life and how carefully they can hide in plain sight. That weekend stayed with me for years. I changed my habits, my booking practices, and the way I trusted strangers. And every time I see a quiet, empty street at night, I think about that house and the person who might still be watching. I booked the Airbnb for a late November trip, hoping to escape the city for a few days and finish some work without distraction. The house was on the outskirts of a small town, listed as quiet and private, with a fireplace, 2 bedrooms, and a small backyard. The pictures made it look warm and cozy, with soft lighting and rustic furniture. When I arrived, the sky was gray and low, heavy with clouds that promised rain. The road leading to the house was narrow, flanked by tall trees that had already shed most of their leaves. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and decaying foliage. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, isolated from the rest of the neighborhood. The driveway was cracked, and the lawn was unkempt, the grass long and uneven, dotted with fallen leaves. The front door was a dark wood, slightly warped with age. I used the key code provided by the host and stepped inside, feeling the sudden warmth of the house against the cold air. The smell was faintly musty, like the house had been closed up for weeks, but clean enough to be comfortable. The floors creaked under my weight, and the walls were painted a dull cream. The furniture was basic but functional. A couch with worn cushions, a small coffee table, a television, and a few shelves lined with books and knickknacks that looked carefully arranged. I unpacked my things, placing my suitcase in the main bedroom and my laptop on the dining table. I made a cup of coffee and settled into the couch, noticing how quiet it was outside. The absence of sound felt heavy. No cars passed by, no birds called, no distant voices. Only the occasional rustle of leaves from the trees brushing against each other in the wind. I told myself it was part of the peace I had come for. That night, I tried to sleep, but the house felt alive in a subtle, unsettling way. The floorboards groaned, the pipes gurgled, and somewhere above me, I could hear a soft tapping, irregular and deliberate. I had thought the house was only 1 story, but the attic hatch in the hallway caught my attention. The noises stopped as soon as I moved, then resumed when I tried to ignore them. I lay awake for hours, counting the minutes as shadows shifted across the walls with the weak light of the street lamps outside. The next morning, I forced myself to stay busy. I brewed coffee, opened the sliding glass door to the backyard, and looked out at the small yard framed by a wooden fence. The grass was damp from overnight rain, and the leaves were slick and brown. I noticed subtle impressions in the soil near the fence, almost like footprints. I convinced myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or stray cat, but the prints were too large and spaced too evenly. I worked for most of the day, trying to ignore the sense of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. By evening, I realized small things inside the house were off. A kitchen drawer that I hadn't used was slightly open. A few towels in the bathroom were unfolded. One of the mugs I had set on the counter was no longer where I had left it. I checked the windows and doors. All were locked. I hadn't moved anything, and I was careful with every detail. The house was quiet again, but the quiet now felt heavier, almost expectant. That night, the noises returned. Footsteps above me, deliberate and slow, moving back and forth. I could hear something shifting in the attic hatch. The sliding glass door to the backyard had been locked before I went to bed, but I noticed a faint gap at the bottom of the frame in the morning, as if it had been lifted and set down carelessly. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, watching the door and listening. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The realization that someone could have entered while I slept made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I decided to leave the next morning. I packed everything quickly, double-checked the locks, and left the key in the lockbox. The impression of the backyard and the house, quiet and unnervingly still, stayed with me the whole drive back. On the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw movement at the edge of the cul-de-sac, a shadow flitting between the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Once home, I reported the stay to the Airbnb platform, describing everything in detail. The footprints in the yard, the noises, the unlocked door, the minor disturbances inside the house. The host claimed no knowledge of any problem, and the platform refunded my money. I didn't pursue it further. What mattered was that I had left safely, but the memory of that weekend lingered. The fear was not supernatural. There were no ghosts, no monsters, no unexplained phenomena. The terror was in the real possibility that someone had been in the house while I was there. The subtle movements, the faint impressions, the noises, they were ordinary things alone, but together they built an atmosphere that made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't before. It was a lesson in awareness, in trusting instinct over appearances, and in understanding how easily normal spaces can become threatening when someone else manipulates them. Since that November trip, I never booked isolated Airbnb properties again. I avoided locations that were too remote, properties without visible security features, and hosts without multiple, detailed reviews. I inspected doors and windows carefully, tested locks, and always considered the layout of a property before committing to a stay. I still travel, but I am vigilant now. The memory of that house, the overgrown yard, the empty streets, and the quiet that pressed in from all sides serves as a reminder that fear does not need fantasy to be real. It exists in the ordinary, in the small details, and in moments when isolation and trust collide. Even months later, the experience remains vivid. The feeling of being watched, the subtle changes inside the house, and the quiet November nights I spent on edge are reminders of how small things can create a profound sense of danger. That weekend was not just unsettling. It reshaped how I approached travel and how I understood the vulnerability of being alone in someone else's home. I learned that caution, observation, and attention to detail are the only real protections when a place seems safe but carries hidden threats. It was a slow, quiet kind of horror, and it was entirely real. We had been planning the trip for months. Four of us, all close friends since college, decided to rent a secluded Airbnb up in the mountains. It was early October, and we wanted a weekend escape from the city, somewhere quiet, where we could hike, drink, and just disappear for a few days. The house looked perfect in the photos. A 2-story wooden cabin, large windows, a wraparound porch, and deep forest on all sides. The host's profile was friendly, though sparse, and the reviews were good, mentioning privacy and the beautiful setting. That was the main selling point. We didn't want neighbors, we wanted isolation. We arrived just as the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. The drive up was longer than Google Maps had predicted. The road narrowed to a single lane in parts, lined with gnarled oaks and pines that seemed to lean over the car. The GPS lost signal a few times, forcing us to rely on signs that were often worn or missing entirely. By the time we reached the driveway, the air had already cooled, and a thin fog had begun to settle in the valleys below. The cabin itself was everything the listing promised. With smoke smell from the fireplace lingered faintly in the air, the porch creaked under our weight, and the windows reflected the pink-orange sky. We were excited, laughing as we unloaded our bags, setting up the living room for snacks and drinks later. The first night was uneventful, almost blissful. We cooked together in the small but functional kitchen, lighting the fireplace as darkness fully fell. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. At some point, I realized how quiet it was compared to the city, so quiet that it almost felt unnatural. I shook it off as the usual first-night tension in a strange place. None of us slept particularly well, though. Every creak, every shift of the house sounded louder than it should have, and the isolation played tricks on our minds. The next morning, we set out for a hike. The path led into the forest behind the house, steep and uneven, with roots and rocks that made footing tricky. We stayed together, joking and teasing, but I noticed the silence of the woods was deeper than I expected. Birds didn't sing much, and small animal sounds were almost absent. By noon, the sun was high enough to cut through the canopy, and we reached a clearing with a view over the valley. It was breathtaking. We took pictures, laughed at how far we'd come from our phones and daily routines, and turned back to head to the cabin. By mid-afternoon, the sense of unease started creeping in. Our phones had no signal, which we had expected, but I hadn't realized how disorienting it would be. The GPS on my watch had stopped working entirely. We felt completely cut off. We were joking at first, pretending we were in a survival movie, but even those jokes couldn't mask the sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Back at the cabin, things started to feel off. Not immediately. At first, it was little things. Doors that seemed slightly ajar when we were sure we had closed them. Objects not quite where we had left them. The sound of footsteps from the attic above us, though we had been alone. My friends laughed it off, saying it was just the old house settling. I tried to convince myself the same, but I noticed that every time one of us went into another room, the others felt the need to check the locks and windows again. That night, the tension grew. We were sitting in the living room, the fireplace crackling, trying to watch a movie. The house made noises, more than normal, and the wind had picked up outside. At one point, a loud knock echoed from the front door. I froze. We all did. The door was locked, and there was no path to the house from any nearby road that I could see. No one was around. Another knock followed, softer this time, almost deliberate. We didn't speak. I grabbed a flashlight, moving cautiously to the door. Outside, the porch was empty. Nothing moved in the fog except the trees. We debated leaving, but it was almost nightfall, and the drive down was treacherous in the dark. We decided to stay in, locking all doors and windows, sitting together in the living room until exhaustion overtook our nerves. None of us slept that night, taking turns keeping watch, our nervous energy high. Every little sound, branches scraping the walls, the wind knocking against the windows, even our own shadows in the firelight, felt threatening. The next morning, we tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. A house in the forest makes noises. Fog and wind can play tricks. We forced smiles, packed our hiking gear, and went for another day-long hike. The woods felt different this time. The fog clung lower, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet. I kept thinking I saw figures between the trees, but each time we moved closer, there was nothing. The hike, which should have been calming, made me more anxious. My friends tried to stay upbeat, but even their laughter was tighter, more strained. When we returned, the cabin had changed in subtle ways. Our bags had been moved. A towel that had been neatly folded on a rack was now crumpled on the floor. The back door, which had been locked, had a scratch along the wood, like something had tried to force it. I remember feeling my chest tighten, a cold knot of fear forming. We all avoided speaking, just unpacking what we had carried in, checking locks, counting windows. The thought that someone could be near us without us seeing them, in this isolated place, was unbearable. We spent that night in one room, doors barricaded with furniture, flashlights on, phones out, but still no signal. Outside, the fog pressed close against the windows, and the wind carried noises that didn't belong. Footsteps crunching on gravel, branches snapping, soft scraping sounds along the porch. We tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually won, and we drifted in and out of sleep, constantly startled awake by creaks and knocks. By the morning, the fear had reached its peak. None of us spoke about it much, but the air was thick with it. We decided then and there that we would leave immediately, no matter what. We packed quickly, keeping an eye on every movement outside, our paranoia running high. The drive down the mountain was tense and silent. Every turn and shadow in the tree line made us flinch, and every vehicle we saw, or didn't see, added to the tension. Once we reached the main road and got back to cell service, the sense of isolation lifted almost instantly. We checked the Airbnb's reviews again, looking for anything similar. Nothing mentioned any unusual activity, no unexplained sounds or moves. It was as if the house had been fine for everyone else, but something about our timing, our presence, or just the isolation had made it a pressure cooker for fear. Later, reflecting on it, I realized that the fear wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about the vulnerability of being completely alone in a place that could be entered unseen, the mind's natural reaction to that vulnerability, and the way isolation amplifies small, ordinary occurrences into terror. The knocks, the scratches, the footsteps. Maybe a raccoon, maybe just the house settling. But in that fog, in that silence, they became enormous. We agreed never to return, never to take isolation for granted again. That cabin, which looked so inviting online, had shown us how quickly normal surroundings could feel threatening when you were cut off from the world. The ending of that trip wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a heroic escape. It was a quiet, tense retreat back to civilization, our nerves frayed but intact. By the time we reached the city, the tension eased slowly, like the weight of something pressing on our shoulders had finally lifted. We shared stories and laughed nervously, but the memory of those nights, the sounds, the fog, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest experiences are not about the impossible. They're about being human, alone, and aware of how small you really are in the world. I arrived at the Airbnb just as the sun was slipping below the horizon, painting the sky in dull oranges and grays. The house was supposed to be small and cozy, a quiet retreat for the weekend while I focused on finishing a project. The GPS had guided me down a narrow, twisting road that was lined with dense trees, and by the time I reached the property, the streetlights were few and far between. The house itself was a two-story structure with faded white siding and a dark roof. The yard was overgrown, and a few garden tools leaned against the side of the house as if abandoned. I parked in the driveway and checked the lockbox for the key. It slid open easily, and I stepped inside, expecting the comfort and order shown in the pictures on the listing. Inside, the house smelled faintly of mildew, though the surfaces were clean. The walls were painted a pale yellow, and the floors were wooden, smooth and cold beneath my feet. Everything was functional. Lights worked, the bathroom was stocked with towels, and the kitchen had the basics. Still, the air felt heavy. I unpacked slowly, placing my suitcase in the bedroom and leaving my laptop on the living room table. I tried to focus on the quiet and empty space as a relief, but there was a subtle tension I couldn't shake, like the house was waiting. At night, the sounds of the house became more pronounced. The wind rattled the windows, the pipes groaned, and occasionally, I thought I heard footsteps on the second floor. I knew there was only one floor in the pictures, but the house had an attic hatch in the hallway. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I kept glancing at the ceiling, expecting something to move. Sleep came in fits, broken by small noises that were usually enough to pull me upright in bed. The next morning, I tried to distract myself. I brewed coffee, opened the sliding glass door to the backyard, and sat on the small wooden deck. The yard stretched farther than I had expected, lined with tall bushes and trees that blocked the view of neighboring houses. The ground was uneven, and the grass was thick and damp from the morning dew. Something about the way the shadows fell across the yard made me uneasy, but I forced myself to focus on work. The house had Wi-Fi, and my laptop connected immediately. I spent most of the day writing, occasionally looking up from the screen to see how the light changed in the yard. That evening, the feeling of being watched returned. It started as a small, uneasy sense in the pit of my stomach, growing heavier as night fell. I couldn't see anyone outside, but there were faint impressions on the grass near the back fence, like someone had walked there recently. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. I went to bed early, thinking exhaustion might help me ignore the tension, but the noises returned. Soft creaks, distant thuds, and a scraping sound near the kitchen made me sit upright and listen. I reminded myself that wooden houses make noises at night, that floors and walls shift, but my pulse raced anyway. On the third day, I explored the house more carefully. I found that some doors, like the linen closet and the hall cabinet, had small items inside that seemed slightly out of place. Towels were unfolded. A single kitchen utensil was moved from its usual spot. At first, I thought I had placed them incorrectly, but the subtle differences were unsettling. When I checked the windows, I noticed smudges on the glass, low enough that they couldn't have been accidental. I cleaned them, thinking maybe it was residue from the previous guest, but the feeling of someone being there didn't dissipate. That night, the sounds became sharper. Footsteps paced above me, deliberate, with pauses and starts. I froze on the couch, flashlight in hand, trying to follow the rhythm. The attic hatch was directly above, and I could hear the soft scrape of something sliding against the wooden boards. I didn't move. Every muscle in my body was tense. The sound stopped abruptly, and a quiet clicking followed, like a latch opening. I realized with a shock that the back door was unlocked. I remembered locking it earlier, checked the doors and windows again, and found them all secure except for that one. Panic set in. I stayed awake until the first light of morning, watching the backyard and the empty street beyond. When I finally dared to step outside, the dew on the grass had impressions that weren't there the night before. Footprints that ended at the fence and seemed to vanish. There were no neighbors in sight, and the street remained quiet. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, a stray cat or raccoon, but the tracks were too large, too deliberate. I packed quickly, leaving the key in the lockbox, and took one last look around the house. The air felt different, heavier than it had when I arrived, and the quiet now carried a sense of expectation. On the drive back to the main road, I noticed a car parked 2 houses down. It was empty, or at least appeared to be, but I felt the weight of observation. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to. Once I returned home, I reported the Airbnb to the platform, providing every detail. The host responded, claiming they had no knowledge of any issue, and the platform refunded my stay. I didn't try to dispute it further. What mattered was that I had left. Reflecting on it later, I realized the true source of the fear wasn't anything extraordinary. There were no ghosts, no monsters. The terror came from the fact that the house was not as empty as it appeared. Someone could have been in and around it, unnoticed, taking advantage of the isolation. The slow accumulation of odd details, the minor disturbances, and the sounds of movement, all of it created a sense of vulnerability. It made me reconsider how easily I trusted the pictures and descriptions of places I booked. From that point on, I became cautious. I booked only highly reviewed properties, preferred hotels or places with visible security measures, and trusted my instincts more than any online review. I avoided isolated areas, and I stayed aware of how doors and windows were secured, even in places I thought were safe. The house stayed in my mind for months, especially quiet nights when I was alone. The lingering thought that someone could be so close without my noticing shaped the way I approached travel. The experience wasn't about supernatural horror, it was about real danger, the subtle and insidious kind that hides in plain sight. Every detail, the smell, the creaks, the footprints, the faint impressions in the yard, reminded me that fear doesn't need fantasy to be real. It exists in the unnoticed, in the quiet, and in the places we think are safe. By the time I finally stopped thinking about that weekend, I had changed how I traveled entirely. I no longer underestimated silence or the way a house could hold secrets. That stay was not just a bad experience. It was a lesson in vigilance, awareness, and the unexpected ways someone else's presence can invade your life without ever showing itself. I booked the Airbnb for a long weekend getaway, wanting a quiet place away from the city to finish some work. The listing was simple: a 2-bedroom house at the edge of a suburban neighborhood, clean, with a small backyard and a well-lit driveway. The price was low for the area, which I thought was a bonus. The GPS led me down a narrow road lined with tall, dense trees, and by the time I reached the house, the sun had just dipped below the horizon. The street was empty, and the houses around were spaced far apart. The house itself looked smaller than the pictures, a faded beige with dark brown shutters, and a narrow path led to the front door. The mailbox was crooked, leaning slightly to one side. I parked and checked the lockbox for the key, sliding it open and stepping inside. The interior smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, not strong, but sharp enough to notice. The floors were wooden, smooth and slightly cold, and the walls were painted an off-white. The living room was furnished with a worn couch, a coffee table, and a small television on a low stand. The kitchen was compact, with the basics arranged neatly. Everything appeared functional. I unpacked slowly, placing my suitcase in the bedroom, leaving my laptop on the dining table, and taking a moment to look around. The house was quiet in a way that felt heavy, almost deliberate, as if the silence itself had weight. That first night, I tried to settle in. The bedroom was at the back of the house, with a sliding glass door leading to the backyard. I left it closed but could see the faint outlines of trees swaying outside. I fell asleep listening to the subtle creaks of the floorboards, thinking it was just the house settling. In the middle of the night, I woke to a scraping noise from the kitchen. My first thought was that it was the wind or a stray branch outside. I lay still, straining to hear, and eventually drifted back to an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I made coffee and opened the sliding door to let in fresh air. The yard was larger than I expected, with uneven grass and patches of dirt where the ground had shifted. I noticed faint impressions near the back fence, like someone had walked there recently. At first, I assumed it was an animal, but the footprints seemed too deliberate and measured for that. I shook it off and went inside to start working. The Wi-Fi connection was stable, and I spent most of the day typing and researching, though I kept glancing outside. The quiet outside felt like it was pressing closer with each passing hour. That evening, I noticed minor things inside the house that didn't make sense. A kitchen drawer was slightly ajar, towels in the bathroom were unfolded, and a coffee mug I hadn't touched was on the counter. I checked everywhere, convinced I must have moved them myself, but nothing explained it fully. I kept doors locked and windows latched, but the unease remained. When night fell, the house seemed to breathe. The pipes creaked, the floors groaned, and a soft tapping came from above, slow and irregular. I realized the sound came from the attic hatch in the hallway. My heart raced, but I told myself it was probably nothing. By the third night, the sense of being watched became overwhelming. The soft tapping from the attic hatch turned into occasional thuds, deliberate and heavy, as if someone was pacing above. I stayed on the couch with the flashlight on, staring at the ceiling. The noises stopped suddenly, replaced by the faint click of a door latch. I froze, realizing the sliding door to the backyard had been unlocked. I remembered locking it before going to bed. I checked all doors and windows. Everything else was secure. The back door, however, had been disturbed. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to move. By morning, the yard showed new signs of disturbance. Footprints led to the fence and ended abruptly. I could see that the grass near the deck had been pressed down in several places. There was no sign of any animal that could have left those marks. I packed quickly, left the key in the lockbox, and drove away without looking back. The feeling of being observed lingered long after I left the property. Once home, I reported the stay to the Airbnb platform, detailing everything I had experienced. The host claimed no knowledge of any issues, and the platform refunded my money. I didn't challenge it further. I just wanted the experience behind me. Over the following weeks, I reflected on what had happened. The fear wasn't supernatural. It was the reality that someone could enter or observe the house without my noticing. The subtle disturbances, the footprints, the sounds of movement, each of them was ordinary in isolation but alarming together. The danger had been real and close, hidden in the details I had almost ignored. From then on, I changed how I booked places. I avoided isolated locations and properties without visible security measures. I checked locks carefully, inspected entries, and trusted my instincts over listings. I stayed only in homes with multiple reviews that confirmed the property's safety. The experience reshaped how I traveled, teaching me that danger does not need exaggeration or fantasy to exist. It hides in quiet houses, empty yards, and subtle changes in the familiar. Months later, I still thought about that house. The quiet streets, the overgrown yard, the minor disturbances. They haunted the way I approached new spaces. Every time I traveled now, I double-checked everything, left lights on, and remained alert, because I had learned that real fear comes from what is possible and unseen. The lesson was clear and unavoidable. Comfort and isolation are easy to trust, but vigilance is the only real protection. That weekend was not just unsettling. It was a personal reminder of how carefully real threats can hide, and how slowly and subtly they can build until you realize you are no longer safe. I booked the place on a whim. My breakup had left me numb, angry, and desperate to get away. I wanted silence, nothing familiar, no people, no reminders. The listing promised isolation, a quiet artist retreat somewhere in the desert. Solar power only, nothing for miles, which sounded perfect. Cheap too. I left San Bernardino just before sunset, the city shrinking behind me as I drove into the low, flat desert. The GPS took me down a dirt road that quickly narrowed to a trail, sand replacing asphalt. The sun dropped below the horizon, leaving the sky orange and then dark blue, and I realized how far from civilization I actually was. The host had messaged me once, shortly after I booked, "Gate sticks, push hard." That was it. No greeting, no instructions beyond the gate. I found it easily enough, a rusty metal arch leaning slightly to one side. I pushed hard like he said, the gate groaning, and stepped onto the sandy drive. The cabin was small, square, nothing picturesque. Just a low, boxy structure with a flat roof, solar panels glinting faintly in the last light. The air smelled like dust and hot metal, heavy and dry. Inside, there was almost nothing. A single mattress lay in the corner, sheets folded neatly, though the smell suggested they hadn't been washed in weeks. A folding table leaned against the wall, and next to it was a locked door I hadn't seen mentioned in the listing. Nothing else. No art, no decorations, no signs of life beyond the dust. The floor creaked under my boots. I dropped my bag, went to the small kitchenette, and noticed the solar-powered lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly. The wind carried the soft, dry hiss of sand sliding over sand. Night fell quickly. The desert was loud, sharper than I remembered. The wind whistled between the cabin and the occasional sparse bush. But it wasn't just wind. Something was moving out there, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps in the sand. I thought it was coyotes at first. I've spent a lot of time in the desert and I know how they move. This wasn't coyotes. Coyotes run, trot, or bound. This was a slow, shuffling motion, dragging feet lightly through the sand, circling again, every so often stopping for a long pause. I would press myself against the wall, straining to hear anything beyond the low scratch of sand, but I never caught a glimpse of anything. By 2 a.m., the motion light outside began triggering in the same pattern. Flash, pause, flash again. I got up several times, flashlight in hand, checking the perimeter. Nothing. The desert was empty, silent except for the occasional hiss of the wind. The sand was untouched, except for my own tire tracks and footsteps. I thought about coyotes again. I thought about every animal I knew of in the desert. Nothing walked like this. Nothing. I stayed in the corner of the mattress for hours, listening. Every time the light flashed outside, my heart jumped. The shadow it cast against the walls looked like someone standing just beyond the glass. But when I moved to check, there was nothing. The desert was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was aware of me, tracking me, listening. The next morning, light spilled over the flat desert, sharp and white. I walked outside carefully, following the sand around the cabin. My boots crunched over fine, dry grains. I wasn't expecting to see anything unusual. The desert looked calm, empty, safe. But then I noticed the footprints. Bare footprints in the sand, heading straight away from the locked door inside the cabin. Small, human-like, but unnervingly precise. They started at the door, went across the floor of the cabin's interior, and led directly outside, disappearing into the desert. There were no other tracks around the house, no tire marks, nothing but the wind-twisted sand. I double-checked the interior. The door was still locked from the inside. Nothing else had been touched. No items moved, no signs of a break-in. The lock itself was intact, but the footprints suggested otherwise. Someone had been inside, had left the room, and then vanished. I ran my hands over the lock, felt the grooves, tried to think of any logical explanation. Could the host have left a key hidden somewhere? Could someone have accessed the cabin while I slept? But the driveway was a quarter-mile of sand. I would have seen tracks, tire marks, something. Nothing. The more I stared at the footprints, the more impossible they felt. They were clean, almost deliberate, as if whoever or whatever wanted me to find them. And yet there was no other evidence. No noise the next morning, no smell of humans or animals, no disturbed sand beyond that line. I backed up slowly toward my car, leaving the cabin behind. My gut told me not to stay another minute. I didn't. On the drive back, the sun burned the sky bright. The desert seemed normal again, the sand still, the bushes unmoving. But I couldn't shake the image of those footprints, small and human, starting at that locked door and leading into nothing. The more I thought about it, the more every detail of the night haunted me. The dragging steps outside, the motion light flashing with no one there, the stillness inside the cabin. Everything pointed to something that shouldn't have been possible. I reported the incident to Airbnb. They asked questions. I sent photos of the cabin, the locked door, the footprints outside. I never got an explanation. The listing was removed a few weeks later, along with every other trace of the host. I've looked for them since, through property records, local businesses, anything. Nothing. It's like the place and the person just evaporated. I still think about that night sometimes. I imagine the locked door and the footprints, and I try to come up with a rational answer. Maybe someone was squatting there. Maybe it was a previous guest, hiding or trapped. Maybe it was a trick of the desert sand. But I've spent years in deserts before, in isolated cabins, alone, and I've never seen anything like that. Never. It left me with a simple, persistent lesson. Isolation comes with risks you can't always see. Cheap, empty places may seem ideal when your life falls apart, but there's always a reason they're cheap, a reason they're hidden, a reason nobody else seems to visit them. That cabin was real. The footprints were real. The dragging steps outside, circling the house in the night, were real. I can still picture them when I close my eyes. The slow, deliberate shuffle, waiting, circling, and then silence. I don't go to remote places anymore. I don't stay in cheap rentals far from anyone who could help me. That night changed how I think about distance, isolation, and the quiet things that can be real out there, just beyond the light.